Welcome, everyone, to the onpoli podcast. I'm Steve Paikin.
And I'm John Michael McGrath.
Today on the pod, it's an historic three-peat for Doug Ford's PC party. We'll discuss what comes next for the province of Ontario.
And our mailbag. You've got questions about the election, and we hopefully have answers. And in your column, my column, I'm going to look at the results and what they mean for the opposition parties.
And in my column, I'm going to take you through why this was such an historic victory for Ford, one that no one saw coming way back in 2018 when he first became Premier.
It's Friday, February 28th, 2025, so let's get to it.
Hey, partner. Good morning. You awake?
Barely. I'm still with us.
We were on the air till 11:15 p.m. last night.
Yes, sir.
I don't know about you. I didn't get to bed till about 1:30.
About that, yeah.
Yeah, it was a bit of a late night.
Yeah,
but
then I woke up early like a dummy, so.
Well, we all do. We all do. But you co-hosted your first election night broadcast last night.
I did.
Well
yes,
done.
That
Did you
was,
have a good
that
time?
Was the first. That was, watching the. We will do the shout out later in the show, but watching the whole team put together 2+ hours of live TV was really something interesting.
Your math is a little off. 3+ hours of live TV.
Oh my God.
Yeah, we got on the air at 8. We did an hour of pregame before the actual.
Keep caffeinating.
That's right. I saw that. I don't know if it was Red Bulls or what, but you had a few cans going last night.
Yes, a few energy drinks have kept me hopefully lucid.
There we go. Now, why have you chosen to wear that today?
I actually wore this shirt at the start of the 2022 election because the writs were issued in the 2022 election on May 4th. And so I thought, I don't know if it is a bookend or whatever, but it felt significant to me, so I picked it out of the drawer today.
There is a double significance to that shirt, and I bet you didn't even know it. Here it comes. You ready?
Go.
You ready?
Yes.
Do you know who died on May the 4th, 1973?
No, I'm going to say
okay. No. Leslie Frost.
Leslie
Frost, former Premier of Ontario, died May 4th, 1973, and he, of course, was the last Premier to three-peat with 3 consecutive majorities, which Doug Ford did last night. So your shirt combines all of that.
Totally accidental, at least on that last part, but I'm happy to take it.
There you go. Now, I am wearing this today because this is Highway 17,
yes,
which, of course, starts in northwestern Ontario and cuts a swath right across the middle of the province. And I thought, what am I going to wear today that sort of tells a bit of a story? And the story that this tells is that if you lived along Highway 17, you were very good to the Progressive Conservative Party last night. Starting in Kenora, coming down to Thunder Bay, Atikokan, Sault Ste. Marie, all these seats went Tory. Over to North Bay, which is Nipissing riding. Vic Fideli comes back with a big win last night. Keep going east, Renfrew, Nipissing, Pembroke. They're all Conservative seats with one exception. Only Sudbury did not end up in the Progressive Conservative camp, but they almost did. And that seat hasn't gone Tory in 40 years, but it almost did. Anyway, Highway 17, very good for the PCs last night, so that's why I'm wearing this. In case you didn't stay up late enough to catch the final seat count, it truly was a great night for Doug Ford and the PCs. Here are the party standings when the House reconvenes, and I add, we think, because there may be some recounts that affect this, but as we sit here today, the PCs last night won 80 seats. That's up 1 from dissolution. The NDP coming back still as official opposition with 27 seats. That's down 2. The Liberals, on the one hand, a good night, their official party once again, 14 seats, that's up 5, but of course there is not a silver lining to some of that. The Greens held their 2 seats, and there's one independent, JMM. Who's the furious and fierce independent in Holdham and Norfolk?
That would be Bobby Ann Brady, who first won her seat in 2022, basically having won a fight with the Progressive Conservative institution in that riding. And it was, I think, a fair question whether she would win again. But not only did she win again, but she kind of walked away with it.
She barely squeaked through. She won by 20,000 votes. I mean, it was an astonishingly good win for her.
Yeah.
So congratulations, Bobby.
Really, it'll be interesting to see her again at the legislature because she has had, and we've had her on the podcast before. She's got some interesting, substantive contributions to the process there, and I look forward to seeing her again.
She is a testament to those who say, you know what, head office at Party HQ. You may think you run the show. You may think you can tell us what to do, but you can't. At the end of the day, the people have the say, and the people have decided 2 elections in a row now. They don't want the official Tory candidate. They want Bobby Brady.
Yeah, kudos to Ms. Brady, and kudos to the voters of Haldeman, Norfolk for not getting bossed around.
There you go. Now, we were, as we say, on the air for about 3.5 hours last night, so we did cover, a lot of stuff. But there were a few things we didn't either emphasize as much as we wanted to, or some neat new things, new wrinkles that we want to bring to people's attention today. So why don't you get us started on that?
Right. So I think the one we've been chatting about maybe most is Mississauga East Cooksville. This is where Bonnie Crombie announced that she would run for a seat because the Progressive Conservative candidate was not running again. The Progressive Conservatives instead ran Sylvia Gualtieri, Patrick Brown's mother-in-law. Gualtieri won. Crombie did not. As of now, the Liberal Party still does not have a leader with a seat in the House. Crombie says she will stay on despite the loss in that riding. But this poses a question of, does she continue to lead the party from outside of the House, as she has for more than a year now, and as Stephen Del Duca did through his entire tenure as leader? Or does she ask one of the Liberals who were elected last night whether they would step aside and allow her to run in a by-election? A few tricks there. One, I'm not sure how safe they think any of their seats really are. After last night, there was a lot of close races all over the province. And on top of that, two, the timing of a by-election is ultimately up to the Premier. So lots of things to consider.
That is true. And you know what? One other thing on that, what can make this awkward at this moment is if there's anybody out there for the Liberal Party who has designs on the leadership and can start to make mischief for Bonnie Crombie. Because if they say, the whole reason we picked you is so that you were going to lead us into a renaissance and potentially beat Doug Ford, and yes, you've improved our position and we're an official party right now, but you don't have a seat, so why should we continue to support you for leader? Except I don't see any of that right now. I don't see anybody pushing those buttons right now.
No, and maybe we can talk about that a bit later, but I think in some ways, Bonnie Crombie comes out of this election with more security than we might have thought. But we're going to move on to Parry Sound, Muskoka, where Green candidate Matt Richter lost to the former sitting member for the Progressive Conservatives, Graydon Smith. Close race once again. Disappointing one, given how much time and energy and money that the Greens poured into that riding. Real heartbreak for them there. But Aislinn Clancy in Kitchener Centre, keeps her seat. That makes her only the second Green to ever win a seat in a general election. Sometimes it's easier to pick up a seat in a by-election. By-elections can be weird, but winning a seat in a general election, I think you and I both tend to give that a bit more substance in our evaluations. And then in Etobicoke Lakeshore, a bit of a surprising win, given that Etobicoke really is, we've referred to it as Ford country since 2010 when Rob Ford was elected as mayor. Lee Fairclough, a Liberal seat right there at the beachhead of Ford Nation, if I could put it that way. But, a solid Liberal win there and defeating Christine Hogarth, who, was... I don't believe she was in cabinet, but she was, a notable member of the Tory caucus. So, important, notable win there.
A couple of things we've watched elections for a long time. Me, maybe a little longer than you.
A little bit.
Some things just don't make any sense to me. The notion that the former mayor of Mississauga, who runs in what was the closest race in Mississauga and somehow loses. Okay, I'm having trouble getting my head around that, as I'm sure the Liberals are. And yet, on the other side of the Humber River, steals a seat away from the Conservatives in Doug Ford's backyard, in the heart of Ford Nation. I don't get it.
Oh, and there were so many results like that. I'm the one I'm still sort of enjoying, also kind of mystified by the morning after is in Ajax, where a cabinet member, Patrice Barnes, lost her seat to a Liberal challenger, Rob Serjanik. Just a wonderful testament to a weird election.
It is weird. Right next door to the Minister of Finance's riding, right?
Yeah. And
makes no sense.
Yeah, and there were a lot of races like that all over. I don't think where we saw another Tory cabinet minister go down, but races all over the province where you just had some really puzzling results, and often right next door to each other.
Yeah, so we'll go through some of them. Okay, let's do another little cutesy item here. You ready for this?
Yes.
Do you remember in 2015 when Justin Trudeau won that majority government, Who was his member of parliament for Ottawa Centre?
That would be Catherine McKenna.
Who won for the NDP last night in Ottawa Centre?
That would be Catherine McKenney.
Catherine McKenna, Catherine McKenney.
Yes.
I just find that very quirky and very adorable.
Yeah. It's
Same writing.
same writing, and Canadian politics can be a small world sometimes.
Right on. Now, does every vote matter? I mean, we've been telling people all last night, right? Every vote counts. Every vote matters. If you lived in Mushkegowuk, James Bay, your vote really mattered. Yeah. At the last count, the NDP candidate has 3,606 votes. The Conservative candidate has 3,602 votes. There is a 4-vote difference. 4 votes. That election could have been decided by who showed up to vote or didn't in one home. I mean, it's possible.
Yeah, like if somebody got a flat tire on the way to the
right.
polling place, right? I do want to say, one of the oddities of this election has to be the seat count. If we don't talk about this, people are going to yell at us. But the Liberal Party won 1.5 million votes, a bit more than 1.5 million, nearly just shy of 30% of the votes, and will come away with something like 14 seats. Again, these numbers might change slightly based on recounts. The NDP got 930,000 votes, or 18.5% of the provincial share, and got 27 seats. We don't have to reiterate the oddness of the first past the post, but I did, when the cameras were off, I did joke with our Liberal guest from last night, Dan Moulton, like, hey, do the Liberals support proportional representation yet?
Or the question is, do the New Democrats still champion proportional representation?
Well, yes, another difficult question there. We know that these kinds of results can happen. I don't think in the last several cycles we've seen quite this much of a divergence between certainly the second and third place parties.
The New Democrats have a famously efficient vote, and the Liberals have a famously inefficient vote, and it was never on better display than last night.
Yeah, well, and part of the efficiency there is that the core of NDP support seems to have mostly stuck by them, despite the inroads that the PCs have made with labor across the province, particularly in like construction trade unions. We talked about Sudbury. They mostly held on in Hamilton. I believe they lost Hamilton Mountain. They put up a good fight in Sault Ste. Marie, but
held Windsor West.
And in Windsor West, right? The core of NDP support still stuck by them in those core places where they got a lot of those seats, whereas the general sort of tide of Liberal support has come back, but it isn't concentrated in enough places to win them more seats.
Right. I'm going to share a bunch of numbers right now, which I think are somewhat disquieting. So humor me, if you will, for a second here. We have 16 million people who live in the province of Ontario. 11 million of the 16 million are eligible to vote. I don't know if you heard, they did not all show up to vote last night.
No, they did
or even in the pre-election votes. 45.4% of the people turned out to vote last night. It's a titch better than last time in 2022, but not much. Doug Ford got 43% of the 45% that voted. You following me here? Doug Ford got 43% of the 45% of Ontarians that voted. So he has 100% of the power, because he got a majority government, and he got 100% of the power having received 19.35% of eligible votes. Look at, he won. Yep. He won fair and square. He won according to the rules. But that feels, I don't know what word I'm looking for right here, but it feels not good.
Yeah, we don't.
Regardless of who won, that would not be good.
Yeah, and we have said this before. This is not a point we're making about like the Tory win being illegitimate. This is disquieting when people don't show up. I realize that people face all kinds of barriers in their lives, but it is so easy to vote in Canadian elections. I was able to vote at my kid's school, so my wife and I dropped our kid off, handed her off to the teacher, got to the polling place, voted, and we're almost all the way out of the door before O Canada started playing.
Well, there you go. Yeah.
So, like, again, I do recognize that it's not always that easy. It has not always been that easy for me. People really do have a ton of options. We have a federal election coming up this year. I sure hope that people start thinking right now about how, making sure you're registered or that you've got the necessary ID. If you Google Elections Canada, valid ID, they've got an extensive list of what you can use. Those kinds of things. Start, thinking about how you're going to vote. Start thinking about that plan early, because I would certainly like to see the federal turnout be better than this Ontario turnout.
When I was a kid, routinely 75, 80% turnouts. Yeah. I mean, we just...
I remember I think one of the Chrétien elections, it got down to 65%, and it was a major topic of discussion, like, oh my gosh, what do we do about turnout being this low? And little did we know it had further to fall.
Well, I hope people tune into the agenda Monday night, because that's going to be our topic. How do we reboot democracy? How do we get people re-engaged? Because to have 100% of the power based on winning 19% of the eligible voters just feels weird. Yeah. Okay, we always talk about the four main parties on this podcast. There were actually, I don't know if you know this, 21 parties that ran for office last night seeking your vote. And the party which came 21st, ironically, was the Electoral Reform Party. They got the fewest votes. They got 240 votes province-wide. And I do wonder whether last night's results will spur on more interest in electoral reform, more interest for the Electoral Reform Party. I don't know, but at the moment, based on the turnout last night and the results for the Electoral Reform Party, seems pretty bleak out there right now.
Yeah, I mean, I think the question, of course, is not just will we see more interest in electoral reform. In fact, the New Democrats were quite straightforward. They wanted to bring in proportional representation if they had won this election. Obviously, that's not going to happen now. But it's that one of those, like, who will bell the cat questions. Getting the Liberals and the New Democrats to agree on the specific type of reform will be one of those questions that you have to answer before this becomes anything close to reality. But of course, they don't currently agree. And I don't know if these results are enough to dislodge any of that resistance. Certainly, at the moment, as we're sort of joking, I mean, the New Democrats don't have a lot of good reasons to push really hard on proportional representation right now.
Right on. Now, just finally here, I was looking for like the truly quirky nugget from last night's election returns, and I think I may have found it. Now, I remember about 50 years ago, there was a husband-wife team at the Ontario legislature, Jim and Marilyn Renwick. Husband-wife both sat in the NDP caucus at the same time. However, I think we have a first last night. I think we have our first brother-sister act at Queen's Park. Rudy Cozzetto won for the PCs in Mississauga Lakeshore. His sister, Sylvia Galtieri, that's Patrick Brown's mother-in-law, defeated Bonnie Crombie in Mississauga East Cooksville. I can't ever recall a brother-sister act at Queen's Park before, so I think that's a first. If anybody out there knows it, I mean, I'm sure somebody. I emailed U of T former Professor Graham White this morning saying, can you think of anything? And he could not think of another brother-sister pair. But if anybody else can, we're all ears.
Yeah, no, I certainly, if you can't remember one, I'm not going to pretend that I have anything locked away there.
Okay, so that's our quirky fact of the day. And with that, let's get off to what's next. After every election in this province, there is a standard choreography that rolls out. After all, we will have a new cast of 124 MPPs at Queen's Park. Most will be returning characters, but there will be some new ones. And then the Premier and his team need to get the show on the road for the 44th Parliament. So, JMM, you're going to take us through some of all of that. First of all, what determines when the Premier visits the Lieutenant Governor and makes his request to her for when he gets to form the next government?
Well, so as we've said a few times on the pod, he isn't actually asking to form the next government, right? He is the current Premier. His his existing government is still the government of Ontario. So what has happened in this election is that the people of Ontario have reaffirmed his government in a sense by returning a legislature in which he will very assuredly have the confidence of the House. Whatever the outcome of those recounts that we've mentioned, there's no real question that the PCs will have a substantial majority. You could call me a pedant because of that distinction, and you would be right. But in this case, it does matter because of the caretaker convention that we've talked about a bunch over the last few weeks. The idea that some of the work of the government shuts down during an election. Because the nature of the government hasn't changed, because the PCs retain their majority, the caretaker convention is no longer in effect. If the government had changed, if a new party held a majority in the legislature, the caretaker convention would continue until that new premier could swear in a cabinet. That's what happened in 2018. That is not the case right now. Basically, as of this morning, the premier and his ministers can go back to making policy and issuing directives and that kind of thing, all of the usual powers that were suspended during the writ period. Now, about that cabinet. Premier Ford has some choices to make. We mentioned that he lost a cabinet minister last night in the riding of Ajax, where Patrice Barnes was defeated. So at the very least, he has a hole in his cabinet he might want to fill there. He can, if he wants to make more changes to his cabinet, if he wants to reflect some of the changes to his caucus. Not a ton of changes, but he might want to. So that's the government. That's one track of what's going on, the premier and his cabinet. Last night wasn't about electing a premier and his cabinet. It was about electing 124 MPPs in 124 ridings. As you and I record this, officially, none of them have been elected yet.
That's right.
Right? Everything we've been talking about has been unofficial results provided by Elections Ontario. Pending those recounts, in about 2 weeks or so, the official results will be published in the Ontario Gazette, which is sort of like the official proceedings of the government. And then after the results are gazetted, as we say, MPPs will then be sworn in at the legislature. Which does not mean that is when the legislature will be convened. That is a decision for the lieutenant governor to make on the advice of her first minister.
Right. And typically, when you get this kind of an election, which is essentially continuity from the last one,
yes.
How much time is there between election night and when Doug Ford or any premier meets the lieutenant governor and they decide on a new swearing in?
Oh, I mean, that could happen reasonably quickly. The premier did not do a day after press conference with the media today, but after his victory speech last night, he did say he wants to get moving as quickly as possible. Now, looking at the calendar, the legislature was supposed to take the week of March 10th off. In theory, they might be able to bring the House back for March 17th. That would require people to really hustle. But it looks to me more like March 24th or even after might be more realistic. Whenever they come back, the first order of business, of course, will be electing a new speaker. Ted Arnott, the former member for Wellington Halton Hills and speaker in the last House, opted not to run again in the election. So there is no obvious presumptive candidate for speaker. Given the importance of the speaker's role, the majority party historically votes for one of their own MPPs to be speaker. But folks may remember, after the 2022 election, the Premier's office got a bit of a rough ride from their own MPPs. They tried to force the Premier's preferred candidate on the House, and MPPs from all parties, including the PCs, backed Arnott instead. We talked about the voters of Haltom and Norfolk. This was a case of MPPs exercising their own independence and not being bossed around.
Secret vote, right?
Yeah.
Secret vote, so you can go for whoever you want.
Absolutely. And the Premier's office can't necessarily punish you. We will see whether there is a similar drama this time around. After the speaker is elected, the following day, the lieutenant governor will deliver the speech from the throne. I've said this before, right? The legislature is convened on the authority of the crown. It is the crown that speaks to MPPs and says, this is the business that I want you to attend to. The speech is written by the government to outline its agenda for the current session of the legislature. You can expect to hear all about the many promises of the PC party that were made throughout the campaign, the need to protect Ontario from the economic harm of Donald Trump's tariffs, and so on. And then get ready to hear about it all over again, because not very much later, The other important piece of business the government needs to bring in before very long, frankly, is a budget. We are in the last day of February as we record this. The new fiscal year starts on April 1st, and the province isn't actually required to bring a budget in before April 1st during an election year. But there are still all sorts of people, bodies, municipalities, school boards, universities, and so on, who are waiting to know how much money they're going to get from the province for the 2025-26 fiscal year. They can't wait forever. They would like Queen's Park to hurry up, please, if you don't mind. So there is some time pressure.
Now, as we indicated, with the Conservatives winning their third consecutive majority, there will be a lot of familiar Conservative faces returning to Queen's Park. But there will be some new faces among the 124 MPPs down there. Yeah. How does that change things, if at all?
Right. So we use the word Queen's Park just to refer generically to the government, but it is also a literal building with rooms and offices in it. And the new MPPs will be assigned offices. There is a bit of a pecking order to this, right? The Conservative backbench will get most of the offices because they are the largest caucus, but there aren't enough spaces for all 124 MPPs in the building. So in general, cabinet ministers, except for the premier, of course, do not get offices in the legislature itself because they have government offices. They have staff. They have offices in the buildings all around the legislative precinct. But Tory backbenchers and opposition MPPs will get assigned offices in the legislature itself, and there's a determination made by legislative staff about like, okay, well, we have space here, and they will try to keep the caucuses relatively close to each other so that you don't get all mixed up and like the Liberals don't have to walk too far to talk to other Liberals, etc. It's worth mentioning here, one reason we have talked so much about the Liberals regaining official party status is that they will not just have MPPs' offices, they will have a budget for their own caucus services office for the first time since 2018. That office will have staff to do things like research and communications and a whole bunch of jobs that for the last several years have really been done on a shoestring. They haven't really had a dedicated budget, a dedicated staff for that. So when we talk about official party status, it is not just a symbolic, it is not just prestige. There is like hard money and resources that come with clearing that 12-seat threshold, as it appears the Liberals have done, not just symbolic.
I hate to do this, but politics being the kind of business it is, this will be inevitable. Doug Ford having won 3 straight elections now, before long, you know that there are going to be people saying, I wonder how much into this next 4 years he's going to stay for. Does he intend to run again? Does he intend at some point to step down and cause a transition to a new leader to happen? You know, he will be a long-serving premier at a certain point. It'd be very high up the list. So what does the future look like for Doug Ford?
In fact, people have already started asking him
No
about
kidding.
that. He was asked about that earlier this week. Let us take a look at his answer.
Will this be your last provincial election?
Boy, you're asking a question. Man, I want to be premier forever. You know, I want to beat out Hazel McCallion with a number of years. God bless Hazel.
Hazel McCallion, of course, was the mayor of Mississauga for 36 years. Now, by the time we're 225 here, so if it's the whole 4 years,
Yes.
that'll take us to 2029. Doug Ford at that point will have been premier for 11 years. He will, at that time, if you can imagine, he's the 26th premier, but he will be 4th on the pecking list for tenure in office if he serves to the end of this term. Oliver Mowat, number 1, at something like 24 years. Bill Davis, number 2, nearly 14 years. Leslie Frost, number 3, at 12 years. And if Doug Ford stays till the end, he'll be the 4th longest serving premier of all time.
Now, I mean, there is a reason why, even if he does not, know deep in his soul that he is in fact going to stick around for all 4 years, he would say that.
Yes.
Because, of course, if you announce even before the votes are cast that actually, you know what, this is probably my last election, it would have really thrown a grenade into the last few days of the campaign. And even now, he's not going to say that he isn't sticking around because you don't want to be a lame duck premier. You don't want people in your caucus to start asking questions about like, well, hang on, why am I going to take marching orders from this guy when I don't know who my next boss is going to be?
Right on. Now, we said last night when we signed off that we were going to spend a lot of time answering Mailbag today. Because we did get a bunch of letters in and emails with questions related to the election campaign. But before we do that, we want to revisit things from last week. Our producer, Matthew O'Mara, asked us if we knew any cases where leaders had gone head-to-head against each other in an election campaign. And we just want to sort of square this circle before we move on into the mailbag. We didn't actually know, but of course, we put the call out to our listeners and viewers, and they did.
The wisdom of the crowd.
Go ahead. What have we got today on that?
So listener Kyle Chen in Mississauga pointed us to the 2003 by-election where Progressive Conservative leader Ernie Eves went up against Green Party leader Frank de Jong,
Right.
This is the Green Party leader before Mike Schreiner, in Dufferin Peel Wellington Grey riding, which has since been broken up. De Jong came in third place. Kyle notes that this outing helped the Greens build momentum for the 2007 general election, where the party received the highest overall vote total ever, with 8% of the vote, not as strong turnout as they received this year with 5%.
You know why they got the super high number that year? Because they ran on defunding the Catholic school system.
right.
That was part of their
I'd forgotten
platform.
that, yes.
And they got a little extra bump up because of that, because there's still a bunch of people in both back then and today who are not completely sold on the notion that we should be publicly funding two separate school systems here.
And for whatever reason, the Greens have de-emphasized that
They
part
have.
of their platform, but it is still part of the Green Party policy universe, if I can put it that way.
Leader against leader. Is there more?
There is indeed. Listener Michael Scott from Toronto did some digging for this next one. He found that in Kitchener Centre by-election, the one that Green Party Ashland Clancy won, the leaders of the Party for People with Special Needs, that leader was Lionel Wayne Posner. I hope I got that right. And the Electoral Reform Party, Peter House, went up against one another. They received 48 and 43 votes, respectively. That's not the percentage of the vote share. They got 48 and 43 votes. We note that there are always many, many independent parties out there in Ontario, and they often choose to compete in by-elections where they have maybe a better shot of raising their profile. So sometimes we get party leaders going up against each other that way. We did not, I think, specify major party leaders.
We should have perhaps specified that. But is there more?
Yes, we've got another one here. Joel Watts points us to 2009 in Haliburton, Kawartha, Lakes Brock. This is one I should have thought of, in which PC leader John Tory went up against the then brand new Ontario Green leader Mike Schreiner, who both ended up losing to Ontario Liberal Rick Johnson. But of course, that a very notable race because I think that is widely understood to have sealed John Tory's fate as the Progressive Conservative leader.
Yes. So, yes, there have been some leader versus leader races, just not for any of the four major political parties, but, or I guess with that one exception of Tory and Schreiner.
Yes.
Lots of minor party leaders going against each other. We also, because we talked about this last week as well, and we wanted to follow up on this, we got some feedback about progressive conservative candidates declining to show up for all candidates debates or issue-oriented debates, and it turns out a very few did. Should we give some kudos to those who actually did?
Absolutely. So, listener Jeremy Rand in Canada Carleton pointed us to a debate where Scott Phelan attended a debate going up against Ontario Liberal Karen McCrimmon. She had won the by-election in 2023 after Marilee Fullerton stepped down. McCrimmon would go on to win her seat last night. Listener Andrew Mugford points us to a few local all-candidate events attended by PC candidate Matthew Ray in Perth, Wellington. Ray won there. We've had Ray on the agenda, I believe. A strong public performer.
Yep.
I can't imagine he was worried too much about debate performance. Terry McDonald in Ingleside noted that PC candidate Nolan Quinn attended an all-candidates debate in Cornwall. He won his seat. Also noted that the former Minister of Municipal Affairs and Housing, I believe he was the government House Leader in the last legislature, Steve Clark, attended a debate in Brockville. Clark won his seat, unsurprisingly. I think he might have won if he hadn't shown up, but I appreciate that he did. Greg Alt in North Bay points us to Vic Fideli, who did take part in a local debate in Nipissing, though Fideli did subsequently miss out other candidate debates. Again, unsurprisingly, he won his riding. And then in Hamilton, we have PC candidate Donna Skelly, who participated in the Cable 14 debate. I believe, Steve, you mentioned that last week. She did win her seat. And finally, Joel Watts points us to PC candidate Dave Smith, who took part in the debate in Peterborough-Kawartha and won his seat as
So
well.
let me get this straight. Every single former sitting member for the Progressive Conservatives that decided to take part in a debate won their seat.
Yes.
So why are the rest of you such a bunch of chickens? Oh, I didn't say that out loud. No. But good for those 7 for participating.
Yes.
And shame on the 117 who didn't. Because you know what? This is called an exercise in democracy. And I guess the listeners themselves can decide if there's a special little place in hell for those who dodge these kinds of things.
Well, and Global News did report that they were in fact instructed not to participate in local debates from the central campaign. So you could also reserve some of your ire for the puppet masters as well.
Amen. Now, normally we get emails at onpolitics@tvo.org, but I see you have there an actual physical piece of mail.
Yes, an actual physical piece of mail. They still exist. And this is from Heather F. Wheat in Peterborough, who writes, Dear Steve and John Michael, I understand that polling is done by landline telephone, which are mostly used by elderly people. Many people under even 50 years of age only have a smartphone. I am under 50. I also still have a landline, but it's a valid concern. Who would trust social media polls? Landlines are perhaps more trustworthy, but using a skewed demographic. Maybe this should be accounted for. Keep up the good work, impartial interviews, pushing for an answer. Stay healthy, warm, and dry. Best wishes from Heather Wheat. Thank you very much for the actual physical letter, Heather. And I do want to note that it seems to be written on the back of a calendar page for a retirement residence, which I just think is wonderful. I mean, reduce, reuse, recycle, right?
Yes, indeed. Now, her point about whether or not pollsters take into account whether or not you're doing internet polling versus landline polling, and landline polling is traditionally thought to be more accurate.
Yes.
Having said that, she points out the demographic skewing of using landlines only nowadays. Pollsters are supposed to take all of that into account and weight their results accordingly. So that shouldn't skew the numbers.
No, and my understanding is that at this point in 2025, most of them are in fact polling people with cell phones. I tend to get more calls on my landline, but I have definitely gotten calls on my cell phone for telephone surveys. But yes, I mean, this is really, the secret sauce that distinguishes pollsters is not so much the act of calling up people and asking them their opinion. It's the model that you then apply to the results you have collected, and whether your results show, a PC lead of 5 points or 7 points or 3 points is really going to rely more on how you weight the data you've collected and less on just the raw data collection itself.
All right, let's continue. We have some new-fashioned as opposed to old-fashioned emails that we can get to as well.
Yes, so here is our question from Bridget in North York, who writes, Hello, Steve and John. Just received from a friend an interesting tool. Wonder if you have seen and might shed light on who is behind the development of tools, as I do not see any endorsement, and she provides a link to smartvoting.ca.
We went to the website. Smart Voting says it is designed to identify the best candidates to prevent a conservative win. So this is all about strategic voting.
Yeah.
It was founded by somebody named J.B. Burrows, who says they get their data from public polling sources like Nanos, Abacus, and Ipsos. They run the data through a model, and they arrive at whatever results they arrive at. So the question then becomes, how useful are these things? We know that there have been efforts to promote strategic voting out there. If you want to stop the conservatives, here is the likelier candidate to do that in leftover shoe riding wherever you go.
Yes.
It's extremely difficult to organize, but those efforts persist.
Yeah, I mean, if anybody who is listening to this podcast, I sure hope you were watching last night, but if you did, you saw both Aaron Kelly and Kim Wright had some very strong feelings on the topic of these kinds of websites. I don't know if they address smart voting in particular, but there's a few different services like this out there, and there's a few problems with them. The first is that as much as the polling data that we have is generally, actually pollsters had some pretty good nights last night. Mm-hmm. The results were largely in line with what we thought in terms of the vote shares. The seat count surprised a lot of people, but as good a night as the pollsters had, it turns out that when you try to aggregate these numbers and feed them into a model, the predictions just are not very good. At a seat-by-seat level, it's just very difficult to make these kinds of predictions. And as Kim Wright was almost banging the table about, like, in some cases, outright misleading in terms of indicating which candidate would go on to win which seats. I mean, the one that is most in my mind is, in the riding of Hamilton Centre, for example, a lot of models will bake in a certain amount of incumbency bias. They will presume that the incumbent will have an easier time winning. So I saw a prediction that Sarah Jama would win Hamilton Centre quite handily, or that she was the strongest contender to defeat a Conservative. She ended up not having a very good night at all. The NDP won Hamilton Centre back quite easily. That's the kind of thing that these kinds of models just can't really handle.
I note today I got a press release from a group called Cooperate for Canada. NotOneSeat.ca is their website. And they are upset today. They are upset today because they say, we are extremely disappointed with the leaders of the progressive parties, referring to the Liberals, New Democrats, and Greens. They could have prevented Doug Ford's re-election had they cooperated, but they insisted on playing partisan politics. I mean, this is one of the difficulties in trying to get, if you want to talk about the Liberals and New Democrats in particular, two parties to cooperate on defeating the Tories when they can't stand each other more than they can't stand the Tories. I mean, this is the problem. And Kim Wright did tell us last night. She said, what do you want us to make common cause with the Liberals for? We think they're terrible on a range of issues, and we wouldn't want them in office any more than we want the Tories in. So, of course, we want to have New Democrat options in every single riding.
Right, and she was particularly upset about the case of Eglinton Lawrence, where I don't know if I can editorialize and say, due to shenanigans, an NDP candidate was not on the ballot, and that denied NDP-leaning voters the opportunity to mark a box for that party. And in the end, well, actually, I haven't even checked this morning, but that was a close one. But the Liberals
Tories
did not
won.
end up. Yeah, so the Liberals did not end up picking that one up.
Yeah. Okay, next one.
This is an email from listener Paul Dillon, who writes in about vote totals. If the incumbent party in the Ontario election receives less than 50% of the votes, and if the second and third parties in the vote count get more than the incumbent's total, can those two parties, i.e. second and third place, apply to form a coalition government? Thanks, Paul.
Well, Paul, you got to remember here, our elections are not actually about picking a premier. We don't directly elect our premiers in the way that in the United States they directly elect their governors. We elect parliaments, right? We choose 124 people to go down to Queen's Park to represent us. And whichever group / political party can command the confidence of the House, in other words, get the majority of that 124 to vote for them, well, they win. They get to govern. That's how it works. Now, obviously, after this last election, there is a progressive conservative majority at Queen's Park, and as long as they stick together as a group, they will win every single vote and govern. But 40 years ago, we saw a very different situation. We did see the party that won the second most number of seats and the party that won the third most number of seats combine their seats. It wasn't a formal coalition government, but they did have a kind of a non-aggression pact, an accord, where they agreed to defeat the party that had won the largest number of seats, but only had a minority. And for those who remember, it was Frank Miller's Progressive Conservatives at 52 seats, David Peterson's Liberals at 48, and Bob Rae's New Democrats at 25. And the 48 and the 25 combined together to kick out the 52. So even though the Tories technically came first, they ended up out of power. So not a formal coalition, but certainly well within the rules for second and third place to get together and form a workable majority.
Right, and that only works in the case where the number of seats is in dispute, and that's right. In that case, it's not a question of the vote share that they got across the province. And even in the case of where opposition parties have won more than 50% of the seats, coalitions are hardly guaranteed. As we've already discussed, perhaps too much, there are major policy differences between the Liberals and the New Democrats. A lot of animosity between the two parties, even like just on basic interpersonal levels. It's one of those things you really get immersed in at Queen's Park. That said, Bonnie Crombie did say relatively late in the campaign that she would absolutely work to defeat Doug Ford in a minority legislature. Had that arrived, it did not, so we don't know how that will go. But hammering out the nuts and bolts of a deal between the Liberals and the NDP to unseat a progressive conservative government, I think would have been easier said than done. I would just remind people that Stephen Harper governed as a minority prime minister for 5 years before he ever won a majority, and only for one relatively brief, though intense moment, did he ever face a serious challenge from the opposition parties to unseat his government.
Quite so. Let's do another one. Here is a note from Luke Durner in Parry Sound, Muskoka. Oh, that was a big race last night. Who writes, "Hi, JMM and Steve. My favorite part about drawing up the writ is knowing more on-poly episodes are about to drop. So thank you for covering this period as usual. I live in Parry Sound, Muskoka, and you two have done an excellent job of covering our interesting elections between the PC and Green parties. It looks like Green candidate Matt Richter has lost to PC candidate Graydon Smith yet again by a similar margin as last time. What's interesting, though, is that last time our Liberal candidate had been dropped by the party, and this time they parachuted a candidate in from Sudbury. What does history say about these parachute candidates in our province? Are they ever successful, or are they disruptive? Would love to hear your perspective. Sincerely, Luke Durer." Luke, the situation that you've just described seems to have been the case in Sault Ste. Marie, where Chris Scott was a parachuted candidate, if you like, who was originally, I think he's originally from Newmarket. I think he may live in Sudbury right now. He became the PC candidate in Sault Ste. Marie, and he won. It was a 118 vote difference, right? Super close. But at the end of the day, a win is a win is a win, and he's going to be the new MPP there.
Yeah, I mean, the times that these kinds of candidates can really be successful are in those surprise wave elections, right? And go back to 2011, where Jack Layton's NDP federally had a somewhat unexpected success. But they elected a lot of Quebec MPs, some of whom were shocked to discover that they'd won. I think some of them might have even been shocked to discover they were on the ballot.
Remember, one of them was in Las Vegas on a vacation in the middle of the writ period?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And yet some of those people then went on to become, very noteworthy and important MPs, people who served quite honorably in the Commons. So, I mean, in the spirit of mourning after charity, let's extend Chris Scott the benefit of the doubt, and we will wish the best for him and his constituents.
For sure.
Again, if you would like to ask about content on the show, you can email us at onpolitics@tvo.org.
And with that, it's off to your column, my column. Time now for our regular feature, Your Column, My Column, in which JMM and I chat about the columns we wrote for TVO.org. And these columns we did not write earlier in the week. I think we wrote them last night. It was a long night.
Well, I will let you know a little secret. Mine is not done yet.
Okay.
I might need even more caffeine before I finish it off. But I know what it is going to be about. And I really want to look at the results here for the opposition parties. I think if you look at both the Liberals and the NDP, a lot of hard questions for them to answer, and a lot of different ways this could go now over the next 4 years. The NDP have had some disappointments, I think, over the last election cycles, but I don't think I don't think there's a destiny here. We could see things turn around for them. And I think as much as there were disappointments for the Liberals last night, particularly in Mississauga, East Cooksville, I think in some ways they might be better suited, or they may have gotten a better result last night than some people are giving them credit for. And eventually that will all be on a page somewhere in a bit more of a structured format. So I do hope that'll be online soon. How about yourself, Steve?
Well, for my last column of Election 44, I really wanted to focus on two things that the Progressive Conservatives did to have such an historic night that they had last night. The first issue, of course, was timing. They made the decision, Doug Ford did, to call an early snap election. It worked out. The second thing they did is the framing or narrative of the election. They decided this would be an election about taking on Donald Trump and his tariffs, about protecting Ontario, and that framing worked. I mean, clearly there were enough people out there who decided that the timing of the election was not a problem, and the framing or narrative of the election they were content with as an explanation for going to the polls early, and as a result, they did not take it out on Doug Ford. In fact, they gave him a third straight mandate. So that's what that column is about. The key important decisions Doug Ford made, And the notion that, I mean, this is kind of how I start the column, the notion that in 2018, before that election that year, if you had come to me and said, can you imagine Doug Ford is going to be the guy to win 3 straight majorities and tie a record that hasn't been set since 1959? I mean, how many people would have said yes to that? The answer is none.
If I can very quickly do one better for you, I mean, I first covered Doug Ford when he was the Toronto City Councillor, and if you had told me in, say, 2014, at the end of his unsuccessful mayoral run, that a bit more than a decade later, he would be one of the most prominent, relatively moderate leaders of conservative politics in Canada, I would have laughed you, and I would have been wrong, but there we are.
Politics is a funny business. And that is the On Poly podcast for this Friday, February 28th, 2025.
You can follow our show on Apple Podcasts so that you get notified each time a new episode is available, and you can see the video version of the podcast on the TVO Today YouTube channel.
Any feedback you have, we're always happy to hear it, good, bad, or indifferent. Write us an email at onpolitics@tvo.org. Please include your first and last name and where you're located.
This week's episode was produced and edited by Matthew O'Mara, video editing by Colin Kish.
Production support from Jonathan Hallowell and TVO's Digital Media Services team.
Our managing editor is Katie O'Connor. Laurie Few is the executive producer of Digital. John Ferry is vice president of programming and content.
We always like to thank our studio crew.
Sorry, Steve. I'm going to interrupt you here.
Uh-oh.
We always shout out the crew, and they deserve absolutely every bit of praise we give them, because this last night was my first time in the center of the machine, watching it all create the content, and it was phenomenal, and everybody did a phenomenal job. But you are not going to shout out one person who deserves a shout out. We're going to be with this legislature for another 4 years. That's a long time in politics, a long time in journalism, and I just want to say it was a real joy to cover one more election with you.
JMM. Put it there, pal. Thanks a lot. Well, didn't see that coming, but that was very nice. I was going to give my shout out to the people of Ontario who went to vote. You know, voting isn't that difficult, but a lot of people don't do it. So for those who do it, good on you.
Thank you.
Now, we are back to our regular schedule at the close of the 2025 election. So that's back to 1 episode per week. So we will see you again next Friday. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye-bye, everyone.